Hey, we have a microphone now. God damn it. Welcome back. It's yet another episode of Tony Awkwardly Talks to a Camera, and this week I'm going to be explaining and talking about trucks, namely freestyle trucks, because the number one question that I get the most through Offset is, what truck should I use? Does this truck fit this board? What's the difference between this truck and that truck, and why would I use this one instead of that? Because things have got a lot more complicated now. When I started freestyle, you had two choices. You had tracker and you had indie. And now there's a lot more than just low truck, tall truck. So I'm going to try and cover some of the differences between them, why you'd use this instead of that, and which trucks to go for and which to avoid. And hopefully this will be both interesting and informative, or at the very least, informative. Maybe. When you're trying to choose a set of trucks, the first consideration you have to make is, will it fit right with my deck? If you're coming from street skating, you're used to your 129, your 149, etc., and kind of loosely what it lines up with. With freestyle, you have to be much more specific. Now, my general rule of thumb is you want to measure the axle length, which annoyingly is something that most people won't give you, because it does change. Even though they're nominally the same truck, that will be different. That's why if you go over to my site, Offset Skate Supply, all the trucks are listed with full axle measurements. So this 6.9 inch axle, then you add on 0.35, and that will give you roughly what deck it will line up with. So my Pro model ended up being 7.25 or 7.3, I can't even remember offhand, because that lines up with the trucks that I wanted to use. That's why most freestyle boards come in like one or two different sizes, because they have to fit a truck. And that's really important, because if you get that wrong, the board won't sit in rail properly. Now, for sake of argument, you've got two categories. What I refer to as the 10X and the 11X. Now, this is the Paris, this is the Ace 11. This axle will work really well for 7.5 or 7.6. And honestly, there's not a lot available in that size at all. I don't know why. Most truck companies have a 10X, and then they'll jump up to a 12X, which is not really any good for anything other than 7.9 or 8. So I'm actually not going to be covering the Ace or anything in this size today. There are a couple of other options I'm trying to get hold of, so I might cover the 7.6 at some point. For now, we're going to cover the 10X and hope that you want to skate at 7.25, which you should actually, because this is really good. It's a very good board. Once you know what width you want to skate, you've got to figure out how tall you want your setup to be, because that's the biggest differentiator between different types of trucks. We can break it down into three different groups. We have low trucks, mid trucks, and high trucks or tall trucks. And which one of those groups you go for will have the biggest influence on how your board feels for various different types of tricks. Me personally, I use mid trucks because those are a good all-rounder. They work fairly well for most types of tricks. But if you're looking to specialize, it's worth looking at either low or high, depending on what it is you want to get involved with. For instance, last year, I used full tracks exclusively for a full year. Now, full tracks I'll go over fully in a minute, but they're really low trucks, and I even got rid of my risers to bring it even closer to the deck. The major benefit of that for me was that all of a sudden, I could 720 shove it without the board flipping over, because a lower board will stay more stable throughout the flip. When I move back up to mid trucks, like these films, all of a sudden everything becomes a little bit more tipsy. But then if I went all the way up to high trucks, while I wouldn't be able to do, say, frontside 720 shove-its anymore, I would find these a lot easier to do rail tricks and pogo tricks, which is why these are currently on my single kick. So that's the first decision you've got to make. What do you want to specialize in, and choose your trucks based on that criteria. I'm going to go through these group by group so that you can see the different options that are available in each height. So let's start off with the low trucks. Now, if you want to skate something low, you basically have two options right now, and that's the Bear and the Tracker Full Track. Annoyingly, both of these are currently quite difficult to get hold of in the UK. Tracker's distribution can't seem to get any stock in, and for some reason Bear's distributor isn't handling the Polar 105, which is what this is. But if you can get them, both of these are pretty good trucks, but they're very, very different in how they perform. They're pretty much the exact same height, but the Tracker has classic Tracker geometry. It has this swooped angle pivot here. It also has a really good old-fashioned bushing seat, where the bushing is completely encapsulated and fully supported by the base plate. What this means is that the Tracker is a much more stable truck than the Bear. This thing will, in theory, crank right down to completely solid with no turn. Now, that's not really my style, so I tended to run this slightly looser. And even when you run it loose, well, not wobbly loose, but, you know, slacker, it will turn and it carves beautifully. This is a very predictable, very dependable truck. In the past, in like the mid-2000s, these had a big problem with axle slip. It was not uncommon to find someone basically just knocking the axle clean out the other end. Tracker seemed to have really got to grips with that, fixed it, and now if you can get these, there's not much more dependable than a good Tracker Full Track. That's not to say that the Bears aren't themselves great trucks. This is a really nice, really well thought out truck with a lot to offer. Now, this has what most people now kind of expect for a truck. It has a straight pivot coming through, which gives it a very swoopy, divey turn. Now, that's not always what you want for freestyle, but it does lock down quite well. It's still got a good seat for the bushing around the hanger, which means you can get a good barrel in there, and it is fairly well supported. If you look at the bottom of the cup, it's not overhanging the base plate very much, which is really important, especially when you put it under the sort of strain that freestyle does. Now, it is also slightly narrower than the Tracker, not by much, but the axle is slightly narrower, which means you do get a bit more predictable and stable rail landings. Now, the final thing about the Bears that is really good is they have a unique base plate pattern. This weird 8-hole pattern means you can shift the truck forwards and backwards along the board, only by a small amount, but that little amount of adjustment can really change the way a board feels, shortening or lengthening the wheelbase as you see fit. So there's a lot to recommend here. There's also a lot of nice attention to detail going on with the Bears. The pivot cups come pre-lubricated, which means there's not really a breaking in period and there's no squeak. The hanger ends, while not perfectly faced, are really well finished. You're never going to have to worry about the wheel being forced into a slightly different angle by an odd end of the hanger. Also, this hollow here helps reduce the weight of the truck without weakening it significantly. Now, you don't have to worry about weight too much, despite what people tell you, but if you're still buying into the marketing hype and you're really concerned about that, it might be worth having a look at the Bears. The one major downside of low trucks, wheel bite. I don't know how well that shows up on the camera, but that is a proper deep burn. This is the exact setup that I used in Japan a little over a year ago for the World Championships. And halfway through my run, I did a nose-hook one-wheeler, and that wheel was basically just rubbing against that the whole way through. You could feel it, it was horrible. And yeah, there's now like a canyon of wheel bite there. Not nice. With the lows out of the way, it makes sense now to cover the mids. This is probably the most common category. The Aces, for instance, they also count as a mid truck. Most of the trucks that you buy will probably be mids, unless it specifically says otherwise. That means that we've got a fair few options within this category. There's quite a lot to cover. I'm going to try and keep it as brief as possible. Now, we're going to start off with Tracker, because these were my personal favourite trucks for a very, very long time, and that's the race tracks. Now, race tracks are actually slalom trucks, and what we've got here on this board are the Racetrack X. Now, I don't have any stock of racetracks at offset, which is annoying because, like the full tracks, the tracker distributor in the UK can't seem to get hold of anything from Tracker. I don't know what's going on over there right now. It is annoying. But if you can get them, the Racetrack X is a beautiful truck. Just a really good, predictable turn. It's not overly stable, it still wants to carve, but it doesn't really collapse into a turn like Indies do, which is something I'll get into in a minute. They're really well made, really solid. I stress test trucks. I absolutely destroy them. Out of everything that I've ever used, racetracks have lasted the longest. I have completely obliterated them still, but they have lasted a lot longer before they've got to that point. Now the X is, unlike the other trackers, a straight pivot. It's more like what you'd expect from a modern street truck. But they're actually designed for slalom, and that's why you get this. If you buy them straight out of the box, they come with this stupidly long kingpin because they're designed for slalom bushings and for fettling and for adjusting. Now that long kingpin is a nightmare for freestyle, but they take regular hex head kingpins, which most trucks don't now. In fact, out of everything I mentioned so far, which is only 2 or 3 trucks, it's only the trackers that still come with hex head kingpins. What that means is it's quite easy to get a replacement kingpin of a much shorter size so that you're not absolutely destroying your legs if you're into pogos. Now they're also not quite as well supported at the base plate as the full tracks are. Now I'll try and show this in a close-up, but what that means is the bushing washer can actually bend downwards. That means you're actually not able to keep them as rigid as some people would like, and that is a common problem with a lot of modern trucks. You'll see that in some others later on. But really, I can highly recommend these. They're great trucks. They take a lot of abuse. Give them a go. But if you prefer a more stable truck but you still want a mid, consider the other Racetrack X. It's a bit harder to be subtle when you've got whole boards to move around. The Racetrack S is built like a full track. They still have this angled pivot, but other than that, they're basically identical to the Racetrack X. So what I said about that truck also applies here. But what that angled pivot means is that they are much, much more solid in terms of how they turn. They're much less likely to collapse into a turn, although the X is already pretty stable. So if you like the way a full track feels, but you want something a little bit taller, give the RTS a go. Unfortunately, like the other trackers, these are a nightmare to get hold of in the UK right now. But if you're in the US at least, from what I gather, they're still relatively common. The one thing you have to watch out for with the racetracks is they are available in 2 sizes. There's the 106 and the 126. I think trackers still use like 1x6 or whatever. So make sure you get the smaller size, the 106, because the 12s are, for like 7.9, 8-inch boards. And they're used for downhill slalom. It's the smaller slalom size, the 106 that you're looking for. But they're great trucks. So if you use the racetracks as stock, there is absolutely no axle coverage at all. That thing juts out quite a long way. But if you are willing to swap the kingpins out, then yeah, you can have a much more normal kingpin arrangement. And that works fine. The next mid truck I want to talk about is the Film Trucks. Now this is a new truck brand out of France, and I mentioned earlier I've been using the Tracker full tracks, really low trucks for a while. That all changed when these came out. These are fantastic. They're made by the guy who used to run Cliché, big European name in street skating. They were a huge brand team, very significant. So he's not going to cut corners. He's really paid a lot of attention to detail in the Film Trucks, and they're honestly some of the best trucks I've ever used. Turn performance is great, really nice, clean carve, never feel too tippy, and there's a lot to love here. Hanger ends really well finished. Base plate, still got space for a hex head kingpin. Even if they are using splined kingpins, which is bad, and I'll explain why in a little bit, the fact that you can have a regular hex kingpin in there is fantastic. Makes it cheaper to replace, easier to replace, and also means you can use inverted kingpins. Now, the reason you'd do that is because it prevents, the kingpin sticking out too far. It lowers everything down a bit. Not that you need to worry about it with this, because they are designed for grinds. There's already quite a lot of kingpin coverage, which means that when you do know under pogos, if you're that sort of person, it's not going to dig into your leg. Unfortunately, they're not perfect. They do have two kind of issues. Not things that bother me, easy to work around, but I'm flagging them up. Just balance. First of all, they come with this double conical bushing setup. Now, that is bad for so many reasons. If you have a cone bushing underneath the hanger, it makes the truck much more likely to flop into a turn. A barrel underneath is much more solid. But of course, this washer that they provide is only big enough for the conical bushing. So if you do want to change these out, you do also have to replace that bottom washer. Cairo thankfully do an upgrade kit, with a barrel and the larger washer. So, like I said, easy to get around. The other one is that the shape of this base plate, it's got quite a small area here to stand on. Now, that doesn't really bother me a lot, but I've heard a couple of people complain about that. So if you do a lot of truck tricks, it might be worth, looking at a different truck. But if you're doing a lot of truck tricks anyway, why would you ride a mid truck? Go up to a tall truck, get a high. Honestly, it'll work out much better for you in the long run. But yeah, these, fantastic. I've sold so many over the last year, it's crazy. The Film 4.25, definitely recommended. If you can get it, give it a try. Fantastic truck. Oh, it happened. Oh. Right. It had to happen eventually. I'm going to have to talk about indies, aren't I? Wait, give me a second. Time for me to make some enemies. Because there is no truck brand with more loyalty than Independent. People are obsessive with these. And I used to be one of them. I used to be a big fan of Independent. When I started skating in the end of the 90s, start of the 2000s, everyone rode Independents. But not because of brand loyalty, but for a good reason. They were strong trucks. They were solid, dependable. And over the last 20 years, they've got worse and worse and worse. They're just cutting corners, doing everything they can to try and make more profit, which is ridiculous because these are the most expensive trucks you can get, basically now, at least in the UK, and they're terrible. Now, first problem is that they're really outdated design now. They're selling these for cruisers, not for freestyle. They don't care. You've got this straight pivot, which is very dive prone. I'll get to the turning performance in a second. But there's no reinforcement up to the hanger, and this hanger is quite skinny. And what that means is this is really easy to bend. If you go at these hard, they'll never stay straight again. They go all over the place. I stopped using these because they were incredibly bent. Every time I did a frontside 5 shove, they'd just collapse. And I think part of the problem as well is that they're using low-grade metal these days. I've seen so many people snap Independents. And even these, the base plate holes are all widened out because it's just soft, crap metal. Now that leads us to our next problem. They drilled this out, made it wider so you can't fit a hex head kingpin. The reason for that is that the drilling for the kingpin is really sloppy. I've seen a bunch of indies where the kingpin is wobbly straight out the gate. Take it off the shelf, take the hanger off, the kingpin wobbles. If it doesn't wobble to begin with though, it will wobble after a certain amount of time just because the metal's so weak. That hole widens out, the kingpin starts wobbling, and then you might as well throw the truck away. It will never be solid and stable again. It's just junk. If you've got these and you're enjoying them, good for you. If you're looking to buy a truck, to spend your hard-earned money, spend it on anything other than these. They're utter crap. This is a difficult thing to illustrate on camera. It might not carry across quite well. And obviously, before you say it, I know aftermarket kingpin. Believe me, makes no difference. If I got the other one, still had an original kingpin in, you'd see the same problem. There's a big gap around the kingpin. Basically, it's been drilled slightly too large. That's why they use splined kingpins. It grips better in a larger hole. You don't have to be as precise. The problem with that is the second it's under any sort of strain, all that leverage makes the kingpin wobbly because it stretches out the hole even further, and then you end up with a kingpin that wobbles around all over the place. It makes absolutely no difference. It's still held tight, I can't push it out, but the actual hole has been widened up so much that kingpin's going to wobble, and you can feel it when you're riding. It's impossible to get that to stay still. It's just sloppy. So in the interest of journalistic integrity, and so that no one could claim that I was somehow rigging it by using one that I'd tampered with, this is the original kingpin that was in this truck. Now, I've left this bolted to the board. I can't be asked to remove it just for this shot, but that has so much more wobble. It's actually funny, the stock kingpin that it came with is in even worse condition than the replacement aftermarket one. It's not caused by me knocking it out, it's just the Indies drilling is terrible, their metal is cheap, and you put it under any real strain and this happens. And now we get to talk about the high trucks, the tall trucks. Now these are a special use case, let's say. Generally speaking, a taller setup is better for freestyle. Gives you way more stable rail stands, way more clearance for things like rail whips, and a lot more to stand on with truck tricks. As a general rule, go taller. The only exception, the point where you never want to use these, is if you're planning on doing a lot of high-speed shove-its. Trying to do a 720 shove-it on a tall truck, while not impossible, is generally a terrifying experience because the taller the setup is, the more prone it is to tumbling in midair. So, yeah, if you're small, Japanese, you're called Ike, probably stay away from these trucks. Now, really, as far as I know, there are two options for tall trucks in freestyle. Thankfully, they're both really good, so yay, get to be positive. The first one I'm going to talk about is the Paris. This is the Paris 108. Paris are known primarily for doing longboard trucks, but this is a really good TKP, traditional kingpin truck. I cannot recommend this truck enough. If you want a tall truck, this is fantastic. It has a lot of the same design cues as the Indy. You know, it's got this street style kind of straight pivot here. So it wants to turn. I mean, that's what they designed this for. This is a turny truck, but it is a really solid, really well-built truck with lots of support for a barrel bottom bushing. That's what it comes with as standard. So if you put a hard barrel in there, this thing will lock down quite nicely. What is also really nice is that kingpin is massive. And so you get to put a tall top bushing in as well. So if you put, say, some Cairo K-back 2s in there, 98A, this thing will be as solid as you want. It is a great truck for freestyle and I highly recommend it. Now what's also quite nice is even with the tall top bushing, there's still a little bit of kingpin clearance. This isn't going to cause you too much of a problem. And then this, if you're a big fan of pogos, this solid base plate space here, you know, this big rectangular seat, there's loads for you to stand on that. If you're looking at getting into truck tricks, this is the truck you want. It's also got really nicely machined and faced hanger ends. These are really well polished. So yeah, just all around, this is a great truck. Now, it does have, you know, your splined kingpin. I'd much rather it had a traditional hex head, but with how good the machining and finish is on this, it's not really an issue. Definitely recommended, 100%. Now, the other tall truck that we've got here is also actually pretty good. It's a fair bit cheaper than the Paris and it has its quirks, but this, the Gullwing Mission 1, is another really great truck. Now, this is probably the funkiest looking truck I've ever seen. All kinds of weird going on here. You've got the tracker style kind of swept pivot, which means it's inherently more stable. Got this big bushing seat holding the barrel bushing in place, which means there is a lot of support there. But it's a really weird setup. You've got quite a low kingpin, which means you can only put in a small top bushing. But look at the amount of like kingpin clearance there. It's huge. That's ridiculous. That is never going to touch your shin, which again, great if you like doing 900 pogos. It's a bit more of a bulbous and rounded base plate here, but I don't see that being much of a problem. Denham Hill's using these, he absolutely loves them. And Gullwing have a really lovely habit of making their base plates work for hex heads, even though they're using splines now. They are a big fan of inverted kingpins, so if you want to use an inverted kingpin, they'll still work in here, even though it's got that spline. I don't know how easy this will be to see on the camera. I don't have a macro lens, unfortunately, but there's a little ground out piece in the base plate there, specifically so you can still fit a hex head in. Small detail, but I approve of it. It's nice. Now the two tall trucks, Gullwing, Paris, Gullwing, they're both really good. You can't go wrong with either. Which one you go for depends on whether you like a really stable and predictable truck or something that will still turn a little. Really, there's not a lot else between them. You can't go wrong. Both great trucks. I wish I could say that about all the mids. That was a long video. I know this, I'm very sorry, but there is a lot to cover with trucks. I've been involved with a truck company before, I won't mention which one, and I've seen firsthand how cutting corners and tinkering can make a good truck go really bad. So I've tried to cover as much as possible while being as neutral as possible. Despite the fact I've just sat there and slated independent for, 5 minutes, whatever it was. There are now more trucks for a freestyle board than ever. There are some that I don't have here, there are some that I've not covered. If I've not covered them, it doesn't mean that they're bad necessarily, it just means that they could be. I don't know. There are slants, there are tensors, there are mini logo. I've no experience with any of those. They are all budget trucks designed for cruisers, so take that with a pinch of salt. They might be brilliant, I'm not sure. But hopefully you found this informative, hopefully you can take something away from this, and hopefully this will make it easier for you to choose your next set of trucks, whatever they may be, as long as they're not independent. Never independent, never. Anything but. But yeah, that's trucks. Let's go skate. Sod it, let's go. Not hard enough. Demands more.